and I really would recommend it. It's one of my favourite places, certainly in Asia or anywhere in the world. It's very, very spectacular. What about food? Something I know Indonesians are very interested in. You're probably expecting me now to say beef rendang or something like that, but I guess I'm not so picky with food. I really do like all food, and I do like spicy food, so that's a real advantage when travelling in Indonesia and indeed other parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia, particularly, of course, and China as well. In fact, I was quite surprised. I led some study tours of Chilean students, and you'd think, being from Chile, they would like chili and spice, but in fact, Chilean food does not include chili and spice, so they had a bit of a hard time travelling around India in particular. Anything else about me I should tell you? I live in Melbourne. I've lived in Melbourne for a very long time. My children are masters. One is a master's student, and one is a just recently graduated lawyer working in Australia. So they are still very much in the study phase. And indeed, our son is enjoying very much studying overseas right now in Germany. Okay, so in terms of what I thought I'd talk about today, I want to focus on Indonesia and how it sort of fits into the global economy. So I'll be starting off, as I often do in these talks, by explaining how I see the global economy, particularly as it's still recovering from COVID. And I think many economists believe that the world economy has done much better than expected in 2020, with COVID really affecting production in economies, obviously people's ability to work, and people's health. And I certainly was quite pessimistic about how well the economy would do, not just in Australia, but everywhere in 2020, 2021, and so on. But it's interesting, we've learned how to work from home, we've learned how to work effectively away from the office, and in most cases, economies have done better than expected. I do know that the main international agencies, the International Monetary Fund, and so on, in 2020 were saying that we needed to really stimulate the economy, really cut interest rates, really spend money. And it's certainly the case that helped and supported the economy, most economies, but perhaps that we did more than we needed to do, and that's led to some issues with debt. And perhaps the economy might have done okay even without that stimulus, or that much stimulus, I should say. I think we certainly needed the stimulus to the economies. But in any event, in 2023, we sit in quite a different place to what we might have been expecting in 2020. And I guess the main issues are now inflation, with inflation being quite high in many countries. I'm only going to talk briefly about that because it's ironically not such an issue for Indonesia. Historically, of course, inflation and inflation problems have been an issue for Indonesia. So it's a bit ironic, interesting that Indonesia at the moment is not having too bad a problem with inflation, unlike even the United Kingdom, for example. But the other thing that I think is really important to understand is the geopolitical tensions, and I'll focus on the tension between the United States and China and sort of help us to try to understand the tension, but then what does that mean for the economies of the global economy and also particularly the economies of this region, which are being impacted by these geopolitical tensions in very interesting ways. So I'll talk about the opportunities as well as the challenges that this presents for Indonesia. In summary, I think Indonesia is very well placed to profit from some of these changes in the global economy going forward. But as always, Indonesia has its challenges, and resolving some of these challenges is the main thing that Indonesia needs to focus on policy-wise. I think as Jokowi's tenure as president comes to an end, he's been quite effective in terms of the way the economy has performed. Many things have been done quite well, but there's still some of the challenges that were very evident at the start of his tenure, still problematic now and probably will be for some time. But trying to start to address some of the issues around the ease of doing business, particularly, that I'll talk about, I think is a major opportunity for Indonesia to continue to do better and to try to support its economy. All right, so I'll start by just talking about GDP growth or economic growth, as many people call it. As I've mentioned, right now, global growth is not as bad as many people might have feared in 2020. Obviously, the COVID impact on the economy lasted through 2020 or the second half of 2020 into 2021, but it's still being affected, still being felt as many people are ill and not able to work. It's affecting people's ability or willingness and ability to work from home and so on. So it's still having an impact on the economy. In terms of global growth, on the left in the slide here, 3.5% last year, 3% this year, and 3% is the forecast for next year for the global economy. That's well below the trend GDP growth in the last 30 years, which was closer to 5%. So not every year was at 5%, but in many years GDP growth was 5%. But in advanced economies, the fall off in growth has been quite pronounced. So in particular, areas of Europe have performed very poorly. Japan continues to not do very well. And the United States is not doing as well as it had done. So growth last year was 2.7%. A bit of pessimism about this year and next year, 1.5 and 1.4%. That's well below the norm for advanced economies, which is sort of heading up towards 3%. And there is some fear that there might be a recession as central banks raise interest rates, and that pushes down GDP growth. But so far, the economies such as the United States and Australia, indeed, have been quite resilient. They have done quite well despite the big increases in interest rates. In emerging and developing economies, the performance has been better, as it has been historically, about 4%, as you can see there, 4.1% forecast for next year. But that's, again, well below what was occurring prior to COVID, where in most years GDP growth in emerging and developing economies was more like 6% or so. And indeed, in China, 9% was the norm until COVID hit, or just before COVID hit, and as demographics started to affect China's economy, something I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. Just to focus in on emerging and developing Asia, the prediction is that this region will grow faster than anywhere else in the world over the next year and a half or so. So that's a very good thing. 5.3% predicted for this year, 5% for next year for emerging and developing Asia. So this is the sort of growth engine of the global economy. And it's kind of interesting, that's associated with slower growth in China. So normally China would be driving those numbers, but China's not forecast to grow that strongly. So it's very broad based across India, Indonesia, and other parts of emerging and developing Asia, where we're expecting to see this roughly 5% GDP growth. And I think Indonesia is pretty much spot on the average there. It's predicted to grow at about 5% this year and next year. And you can see that's well ahead of the United States, where growth is forecast to only be 1%. And the Euro area with very weak growth. Now, so if we focus in on Indonesia, as I mentioned, it's grown roughly at 5%. It's been very steady growth over the last few years. So not always exactly 5%, but pretty close to it. Of course, when Jokowi was first elected, he was aiming to achieve 7% GDP growth. I can't remember exactly how he worded that, but that was certainly the aim. So 7%, of course, is quite ambitious, but it is possible. It is possible for an economy like Indonesia to grow at 7%. So I guess the question that I'm going to leave for you to think about and discuss for a moment is, why did Indonesia not achieve the 7% growth that Jokowi targeted? And then will Indonesia achieve faster growth until the end of the decade? So we've got two separate questions, obviously related. why did Indonesia not grow so quickly until now, and will it pick up as we move forward over the next few years? So in thinking about this, think about what drives GDP, what drives the economy along, what can support faster growth. So I'm going to stop at a couple of points through my presentation and leave you to think about these issues and discuss them and try to come up with some answers. I'm only going to give you 2 minutes or so, but I'll do that now. I'll put my stopwatch on in a second, and I'll leave you to think about these, and I'll come back in a minute and give you my thoughts on these 2 questions. I'll stop here and give you a chance to think. Okay, well, that's a bit more than a couple of minutes to think about these issues. Not very long, to be honest. This is something that, as an economist, I've spent many years thinking about and discussing and presenting and having my ideas challenged on. So not easy questions, but of course, extremely important questions. And so I think it's useful for you all to have an understanding of how we as economists think about these questions and see if that sort of checks with how you approach these 2 questions. So firstly, in terms of the 7% goal that Indonesia had, the way economists think about economic growth is that there's 3 drivers. I guess in some sense, this theory or this way of thinking about economic growth goes right back to the classical economists in the early 1800s, people like David Ricardo, Adam Smith, and even Karl Marx, who was thinking in this kind of way. And the idea is, if you imagine the economy is a manufacturing economy, so relying on factories, then if you want to get growth in the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, in the factory output, what do you have to do? Well, you either build another factory, have more physical plant or capital, as Karl Marx and economists still call it today. So that's what economists call capital. It's driven by investment in the economy. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do, of course, is put more workers in the factory. And if you've got more workers and they're not going to bump into one another in the factory, then you can put more workers in existing factories, or indeed you can do both. You can build factories and put workers in it, which is how China achieved its very rapid growth. Building new factories from the early 1980s, mid 1980s, and workers moving from the countryside to those factories. And the third factor is productivity. So you can rearrange the factory so that it's more efficient with better production lines and so on. So productivity is a bit of a catch-all, but it's anything that makes those factories more efficient and produce more output with the same capital and labour. So if we think about Indonesia and think about these three factors, how do we sort of think about how Indonesia has gone? Firstly, to the demographics, where to most purposes, the government doesn't have a lot of control over this. Obviously, this population profile is to do with people's choices about how many children to have, but it's also to do with how long people live for. So Indonesia has quite an interesting and pretty typical what's called population profile. It used to be called a population pyramid, but they're not pyramids anymore. So the one on the left here is Indonesia in 1975, where there were a lot of children. So that 0 to 4 age group is the bottom, pink and blue. So what it says is 8% of the population, which is quite very high, in 1975 was aged 0 to 4, and 7.7% and male, and 7.7% were female aged 0 to 4, and you go all the way up, and it should add to roughly 50% on each side. So if you add those numbers up, roughly 30% of the population was below 10, 40% below 15, 50% below 19 in 1975. So very, very young, obviously. And so young indeed that in terms of the economy, the main priority with 50% of the population under 19, under 20, is to educate the population, because that's the majority of the population and that's the future of the economy. If we go to 2020, then on the right, then you can see that that bottom part of the pyramid has been sort of cut off. And now demographers call this the population skyscraper rather than the population pyramid. And so you've got, I didn't add it up, but it looks like about 33% of the population aged below 20, still quite a high number, but not as high as the 50% that was the case in 1975. Education, of course, is still then very much a priority with that large fraction of the population under 20 or under 24. But you can also see that the top part of the pyramid is a little bit fatter. More old people. People are living longer in every country. So what that means is that aged care and pensions become a priority. And that's, of course, a real challenge for Indonesia, is the healthcare needs and looking after those healthcare needs of older people, and also the pension needs and having a pension system which is able to accommodate more and more older people. This is a real challenge for many countries. I'm sure you've all seen the riots and so on in France, where people were very upset about changes to the pension age and protests and so on the streets. But the government was right to make the changes that they did, and indeed they weren't really aggressive enough, because the French pension system is incredibly costly, but getting more costly. It's in many European countries the major expenditure item and a real challenge for governments as to how they fund this, how they afford these expenses. And of course, as we speak in Indonesia, that's not such a big challenge, but going forward, you still need to make sure you look after older people, both in terms of health and in terms of pensions. So that will be more of a challenge for Indonesia. And the other issue is, what is the fraction of the population that is of working age and driving the economy, driving economic growth? Indonesia actually is not too bad. So this is the population between 15 or 20 and 65, or it depends how old you think people are when they need to retire. But roughly speaking, in that 20 to 65 age group, Indonesia has quite a high fraction of the population of working age, which is good. And it's still quite a young population, which again is good in terms of economic performance. So what economists would say is Indonesia's demographics are pretty good perhaps different to what they were in 1975, but that's also beneficial in terms of population growth and resource allocation and so on. But relative to other countries, Indonesia has a young workforce and a large workforce relative to the population that can support the economy, support pensions and so on. If we look at Australia, Australia is actually very unusual. Possibly I should have thought of perhaps putting up a European country to show you how flat the sort of pyramid is in some European countries. Australia actually has fewer young people under 20 than Indonesia, as you can see, but we have a bit of a bulge in that 20 to 50 age group. And you can see a little bulge there, particularly 25 to 35. That's because of our migration policy. So in Australia, unlike even more so than the United States or Canada or Germany, we have quite rapid population growth, but it's immigration-driven population growth. So that's that bulge there. Now, interestingly, that is very good for Australia's economic growth because we've got a large fraction of the population that are of working age. But we're dependent on migration for that. And so it'll be very interesting in the next 3 or 4 years to see whether there's still the levels of immigration that we've had in the last decade or so. There's a lot of popular support for migration in Australia, so most people recognise the benefits that it's had for our economy, but there's also a little bit of resentment as particularly property prices in Melbourne and Sydney become very high, and that's in part due to migration and makes it difficult for young people to afford housing. So there are some tensions, but anyway, migration is the major factor driving our demographics in Australia. So demographics is the first thing we need to think about. As I've mentioned, not much policymakers can do about that. Governments in some cases have tried to encourage people to have more children and subsidise childcare and so on, but it's probably not going to change a lot. The next factor is investment. And so here is where Indonesia doesn't do as well as it could or should. So I just got Indonesia, China and Australia on the graphic here. You can see since the 1990s, China's investment share of GDP, so how much of its GDP it sort of plows back into the economy for investment, is very high in China, in the order of 40 to 45%. Now, many economists think that's a little bit too high, but for an emerging economy to get economic growth, you need to have investment share, somewhere up a little bit higher than Indonesia, so that there's the infrastructure being built, the factories being built, etc., that support economic growth. So Indonesia does better than Australia, but Australia has much of that infrastructure. Australia doesn't need to have the high levels of investment. So that's kind of the irony, is that emerging economies need to have more investment to grow very strongly. And if they do have that investment, they almost certainly will grow very strongly. That investment can come from and be financed by either the government, if the government has the money and the willingness. It can be financed by local investors, local people with money who want to build factories and so on. And this is a real challenge for Indonesia. Local investors often look outside Indonesia as well as, or instead of, inside Indonesia because of the challenges of doing business in Indonesia. So that's something, many people think of foreign funded investment, what's called foreign investment or foreign direct investment in particular. And Indonesia doesn't do that well on that front either. But it's not just foreign investors, it's local investors that fund these capital projects. And Indonesia needs to make it easier for local and foreign investors to spend money on capital projects, as well as supporting through the government. So Indonesia is not terrible here, but as I mentioned, it could be better, and investment's share of GDP has been declining in the last few years, which is not a good trend, even if it's only a small decline. So investment historically for Indonesia, I think, has been the issue in the area where there could be more investment and stronger growth arising from that. And as I mentioned a couple of times already, I think the major challenge here, there's lots of different issues that are causing investment to be lower than it could be. Obviously, Indonesia has very challenging geography. You know, you need lots of ports and lots of roads and lots of trains and so on across the archipelago. But that doesn't mean it's not possible to sort of get that happening. And in fact, maybe you need even more investment than similar sort of population-sized countries like Brazil that don't have quite the challenging geography. But I think the main driver of Indonesia's weaker than it should be investment performance is this difficulty of doing business. And I like to look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, which has basically a whole range of ingredients that tell you, and then they're added up and weighted and tell you how easy or difficult it is to do business. So these include things like how easy is it to access electricity and how reliable is that energy and electricity access? How easy is it for a business to file its taxes? How easy is it to start a new business? How much of an issue are things like corruption? So I forget how many. I think there's about a dozen indicators that are put together into this Ease of Doing Business Index. And Indonesia's getting better, but very much in the middle of the pack globally. And if you think about it, again, for a foreign investor, if you're looking for somewhere to go, and many investors are now looking for somewhere to go outside China in manufacturing, for example, then you're going to look at Vietnam, Philippines, and India in particular. India is unfortunately not on here, but India I know is around about the same as Indonesia. And go to the country where it's easiest to do business. Obviously, Singapore does really well, but that's the reason why Singapore grew so quickly in the early stages when it was a poor country in the 1970s and the early 1980s. It was able to grow very quickly because it made it extremely easy from the very early stages to do business. Very low taxes, very cheap land, a very reliable environment in terms of corruption and other sort of challenges to doing business. So it's no mistake that Singapore had fast growth because it was supporting that growth through making it very easy to do business, very easy to start a new business in Singapore compared to other parts of the region. So I think this is the major challenge for Indonesia, is to try to continue to reduce this number. There's been progress, but you know, it's a comparative game, and you need to make sure you're doing better than other countries. Look to countries that have done extremely well. There's no reason to make it difficult to start a new business or to close down a business or you know, basically red tape. So those are particular issues where the government can make a big difference by making it easier. Indonesia has had the special economic zones, which I think are a very good idea. But they haven't done that well because all of these issues around red tape and corruption and so on in particular have not been resolved in those special economic zones in the way that they were in the special economic zones in the early days of Singapore or China's progress. The final factor that's important in terms of driving GDP growth is productivity. So, as I mentioned, productivity is a bit of a catch-all, but it includes a better technology. It may be that you invent and develop things, and Indonesia has actually been very inventive and technologically advanced in new financial technologies and things like that in recent years. But as an emerging economy, typically you can borrow better technologies and pay for them or not pay for them, depending on whether they're patented or not. But you certainly can build better managerial technologies and those sorts of things. So those things all add up to better efficiency. Education, as an economist, education improvement can be sort of measured or captured in terms of better labour quality or better productivity. Doesn't really matter. They're both going to drive higher GDP growth. But again, an ongoing challenge for Indonesia is to raise education standards and continue to raise the level of education of the average Indonesian. So those are all opportunities. Again, Indonesia is making progress, but you can see this is a little bit of a dated graphic here from The Economist magazine, but it is important because those years were years where China did really well. You can see the 4% what's called total factor productivity. That's how much growth China gets over and above the growth in capital and labour in the economy. So they just were very efficient. In China's case, this was moving people from countryside, rural areas to cities to work in factories. And as you take people off the farms, you don't lose much in output on the farms, but you gain a lot in output in the factories. And so that's measured as productivity. You haven't changed the number of workers, you've just changed where they're located. So the capital investment in China, the building of the factories, we've seen earlier in the investment graphic, but also the productivity is associated with that. So a real opportunity right now for Indonesia and India in particular is to try and grab some manufacturing in electronics and textiles, clothing and footwear and those sorts of areas from China, as foreign investors find China more and more difficult. And as China becomes more expensive, as it becomes a middle income and upper middle income country rather than a poorer country. And unfortunately for Indonesia, organisations in those spaces aren't moving to Indonesia as quickly as they could because of these ease of doing business issues. So that's the real opportunity. That's the opportunity to get people out of low-paying jobs in the rural sector into higher-paying jobs in the manufacturing sector, and ultimately on from there, as has been the case with China. And that would raise productivity and raise economic growth. So I think that's the real opportunity for Indonesia going forward, to try to see that happen. So as we look forward, what will happen in Indonesia until the end of the decade? Well, I've sort of already answered this one. In order to get to 7%, Indonesia needs, I think, primarily to address these ease of doing business issues. Indonesia is an attractive market. It is an attractive place to locate new business in manufacturing and elsewise, because it's still relatively cheap. And that's, as an investor, you obviously need to control costs. But that's the major challenge for Indonesia. Of course, Indonesia still has huge infrastructure needs, and to the extent that the government can finance them, that will help support growth. But also, I guess, in Indonesia, public-private partnerships and other partnerships to build infrastructure are very, very important. And then finally, education is a major challenge, but also an opportunity for Indonesia. Can Indonesia find ways to continue to raise the quality of education and the level of education for the average Indonesian? Okay, so what about inflation? So the next issue. You can see from the slide here the sharp rise in inflation in the last couple of years associated with COVID. And there's been several issues that have been the reason why COVID has caused this sharp rise in inflation. Firstly, supply chains. So as people were unable to work and unable to work at ports and so on, the whole global supply chain, which had become very disintegrated. So a car might have parts made in Cambodia, an assembly in China, and then sales to other parts of the world. Now, as one country starts to struggle and its ports shut down and so on, that affects the whole global supply chain. So auto was one example where cars became very expensive, but also very difficult to actually get at various times through 2021 and 2022. And that leads to higher prices. But secondly, again, with COVID affecting supply chains and so on, food prices and energy prices rose, and that's been made worse by the war in Ukraine. So you can see from the graphic and how it's broken down here that food prices have been a major part, the yellow there, of the rise in inflation, but also transport, which is energy, costs have been very important. So overall, this is the global average. Interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, in Indonesia, normally inflation can be a problem and historically has been a problem, but you can see the core inflation there is the red line, and the CPI, the headline inflation number, as economists call it, 4.3%, sort of middle of this year. And that's lower than the global average. And core inflation indeed is quite low in the normal range that central banks would try to target inflation at. So Indonesia hasn't got such a problem. And that's the reason why in Indonesia, the central bank's interest rate has gone up, but only up from 3.5% to 5.75%. So I'm sure some of you are sensitive to this, but that's much less of an increase than what we've seen in many other countries. So obviously that's to do with a number of things. Indonesia's CPI is more based on locally produced food and so on, that perhaps isn't as affected by COVID. But in the end, this is a very good issue for Indonesia. It doesn't have to, I suspect that interest rate there is high enough. It doesn't need to be tightened. I haven't spoken to your central bank to check that, but it certainly looks to me like with inflation coming down there in the last sort of few months or so, that Indonesia doesn't have to worry too much about inflation. And globally, I think inflation is on the fall, and we can hope that that continues to be the case. You can always have a shock that upsets that, but that's the current read I have on inflation. So this is a very, very positive thing for Indonesia. Obviously, inflation, if it's high, affects investors' nerves and sentiments and so on. So it's not a good thing to have too much of. So I'll move on, given where we are in terms of time, to geopolitical issues, which I think is worth talking about and is very important to Indonesia's economic performance, to Australia's economic performance as well, and most parts of the world, in fact. And of course, many people sort of attribute the tensions between China and the United States to Donald Trump being elected to office and starting these sort of tariff wars with China. But I would say that the tensions, the geopolitical tensions between China and the US, and China and other countries as well, became much worse after the election of Xi Jinping, or the rise of Xi Jinping in 2012, 2013. So Xi Jinping is a very different politician to the predecessors, who are much more pragmatic, much more willing to support the economy at the expense of the sort of party ideology. Xi Jinping is much more a traditional Chinese leader focused on the Communist Party first, second and third, and the economy is very distant to the desires of the party. So Xi Jinping, but of course then Donald Trump has sort of pushed things along a bit. And you might think that the Democrats in the United States would be less aggressive, but in fact there's not much difference in terms of China policy between Trump and the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of what's likely to happen with tariffs and so on. So as I mentioned, Xi Jinping is much more ideological, and it's kind of interesting to consider what this means. So the picture here is a screen grab from a soap opera or a series sort of thing aimed at young people in China. So I think it's a Korean one. Xi Jinping has been very outspoken against these types of shows, saying that men should not wear earrings. So the earrings here have been airbrushed out on Chinese media. They shouldn't have sort of long hair and be looking effeminate, looking more like women or as much like women as men. And the watermelon cap there was put on by the censors because the girl's hair was dyed, I think, pink, and that was deemed not to be Chinese. So the ideology is very much a traditional Chinese ideology. I would say that it's an ideology shared maybe by some elderly men like Xi Jinping, but not shared by many young people around the world or in China or elsewhere. But young people are having to bear the costs of this. Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And unfortunately, Xi Jinping has allowed people in China to be much more nationalistic, much more, China is number one, and everything that Xi Jinping and the party does is sort of supported. And of course, censorship makes it very hard to see and understand whether that's very, very widely shared or whether, in fact, it's not the majority view. But certainly Xi Jinping in the media and so on has allowed very nationalist views to become prominent in China. So the ideological position is much more consistent with the sort of Communist Party ideas of Chairman Mao even, but certainly the not so consistent with the Communist Party ideals of Deng Xiaoping and others, who are much more willing to let the economy be first, let people grow rich first, and then worry about sort of communist ideology. So to my mind, this has put China apart from other countries globally. Again, my suspicion is that particularly younger people in China would be quite frustrated with some of these developments, although it is, as I say, quite hard to know whether in fact that's the case. But the other thing is, and this is why I say communism first, second and third, Xi Jinping has put state-owned enterprises and the party ahead of private enterprise. Private enterprises have to have more party members in their leadership and boards and so on. And funding from banks and elsewhere has been encouraged to go to state-owned enterprises and not to private enterprises. This is what economists are really frustrated about with regards to China. Xi Jinping doesn't seem to care if China's economy, I don't think it'll fail, but it really struggles, as it is right now, struggling with a number of issues. And I could talk about real estate if we had time, but the real estate issues in China are very significant. But also, the government has the money in China to bail out the real estate sector, for example, but it's not doing it. In the past, there have been a few issues where the government has bailed out the banks, for example, but they're not supporting those failing real estate enterprises. And real estate is a very, very large part of China's economy. And you can see from the slide here, on the right, the fraction of employment and exports and fixed asset investment that's private sector driven prior to COVID. So not supporting that is a big problem and a big mistake. The latest, I just picked up My Economist magazine, the latest one yesterday, and it's all about the mistakes that this policy, the mistake of this policy and how it's really causing problems for the economy. And of course, Jack Ma, the very well-known head of what was Alibaba and Ant, has had a very famous falling out due to the fact that he was critical of some sort of financial policies in China, and implicitly critical of Xi Jinping, and essentially was not heard of for several months, and now is much less prominent in the media and so on in China than he was 3 or 4 years ago. So Xi Jinping very much saying that, private sector is secondary. I'm not going to have these rock star CEOs and so on, and I and the party are the main drivers of our economy and of our society. So that's been very disappointing, I think. I used to say to my students when traveling to China that you might be frustrated by some issues with regard to politics and so on, but it's sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step backward with regard to policy. I think in recent years it's been 2 steps backwards and 1 step forward, if any steps forward, with the ascension of Xi Jinping. So that's been a disappointment for many, not just economists. And of course, the other thing that's going on in China is this sort of turning inwards, this nationalism, but also turning inwards. So there's a policy in China called dual circulation, and there's many elements to that, but the main element is the fact that China wants to rely less on trade, less on buying stuff, particularly from internationally, and more on domestic production. And in some senses, many countries do this, but it's sort of pushed to a much greater extent in China than in other countries. And of course, on the other side, in the US, the tariffs on China have begun with Trump, but the disputes with China have continued under Biden, and the particular tariffs on certain goods have rise under the Democrats. It's interesting, though, that some of these trade rules, for example, are of the form that in electronics, chip making and so on, you can't have more than 50% Chinese content, and there are specific ways that can be measured. So what has happened is that instead of China and its producers producing, everything in China, some of the parts, for example, have been outsourced to other countries. And then some parts of the production process continue to occur in China, and so that they can get around these tariff rules. And again, The Economist had an article on this recently saying that the US tariffs have had no effect on imports from China, because all that's happened is the imports have sort of included more Vietnamese production, Malaysian production, Singaporean production, and so on, and not really changed the nature of the stuff coming out of China. So Vietnam, Cambodia have been big beneficiaries of this, for example, because some parts of the production process have been moved to those countries. So this is a big opportunity for ASEAN. The United States needs some of these components, these electronics, these other goods. So they're going to get them in the sense that the private sector still wants them, whether the government bans them or not. So all that's happening is there's a movement around in terms of production and supply chains, particularly within ASEAN. Now, Indonesia's not on that graphic there. And I guess part of the reason for that is, again, this issue of Indonesia not being as attractive to move manufacturing, which is the main thing that's affected by these tariffs. So resources and so on aren't so affected. And so in Indonesia's case, Indonesia's main exports aren't affected by these sorts of policies. But it's an opportunity for countries in ASEAN and the region to profit from the tariff wars, because they're shifting around production. And Vietnam in particular has been a real beneficiary of this, although there is some pressure in the United States now to clamp down on this sort of production shifting and perhaps increase tariffs on these components coming from other countries. So watch this space, but I'm not sure that will happen, and only in more sort of sensitive goods. Alrighty, so it's a typo. It should be Vietnam. I was going to stop here, but I've probably already answered this one. And given how we're going for time, I might just keep on going. But obviously that should be Vietnam. I'll fix up that typo. But the reason why Indonesia hasn't gained from the trade wars as much as Vietnam is because of this fact that it's manufacturing that's shifting. Vietnam has a very ready manufacturing workforce, manufacturing infrastructure, factories and so on, basically ready to go. It's also closer to China. So in terms of the logistics of exports and getting to port, that makes things a bit easier. So for example, in auto as well, a lot of auto production of parts has shifted to Cambodia from China. And that's again, in terms of the logistics of getting things from one country into China for domestic production or export are a little bit easier when the country is closer. So there is a geographic disadvantage that Indonesia has, but the other issue is just this difficulty with supporting investment in Indonesia. What else have I got there? So again, Indonesia is not strong enough in these areas of manufacturing in particular. Okay, so let's sort of move along to specifics of some things that are affecting Indonesia. So I guess one thing that Indonesia shares with Australia is this reliance on resource exports. So a very large fraction of our exports are natural resources, and that's why we have done very well in both countries in recent years from the rise of China, because China has wanted our coal and nickel and other natural resources. So the big risk for us, and the reason why, actually I should have looked at the rupiah. I presume the rupiah has fallen in the last couple of months. The Australian dollar has. But the reason for the falls in the Aussie dollar I know about is because there's a fear that China's economy is not doing very well, and that if the Chinese economy stops importing iron ore, for example, that's going to have a major impact on Australia's economy. in my understanding of China and its economy is the government won't let the economy, collapse. So they'll be doing things now to start to support the economy. And the thing that China's leadership, who are mostly engineers, the thing that they all know about is infrastructure. And my suspicion is there'll be a little bit of a push along of some infrastructure projects, particularly around airports, roads, those sorts of things. So I think that will happen, and that will be still a good thing for Australia and Indonesia. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, that is what happened. China had a massive infrastructure push, and Australia and Indonesia boomed, not in 2008 and early 2009, but after that, second half of 2009 and 2010-11, as China really pushed the economy along, but in a way that was very reliant on natural resources. So my suspicion is the current sort of weakness in China might not pan out the way the pessimists are seeing it. However, the real estate sector is also very reliant on natural resources in China. So that's the big unknown, I think. To what extent does the Chinese government let the real estate sector kind of fall over a little bit? So that's one area where the global trade wars and what's happening globally and how it's impacting global economies will affect Indonesia and Australia. As I've mentioned, Indonesia can do better, and it is still an attractive market for manufacturing if you can put the infrastructure in the right places and address some of these other issues. And I think the flow out of China for manufacturing still has many, many years to run. So China has an opportunity in the next decade to try to address some of these issues. So for Indonesia, like Australia, I was interested to see this graphic. China is the main trade partner, 15% of exports, but Australia is actually much higher than that. I think Australia is about 35%, so 36%. So Indonesia is a little bit more diversified than Australia. Japan's still a very big trading partner, as it is for Australia, again, reliant on natural resources, but also the US, India, and other parts of ASEAN are very important trade partners. So there's an opportunity for Indonesia to try to do well out of what's happening in China with natural resources, but also more broadly the sort of global manufacturing environment and production environment. So as I've already mentioned this again, both countries are vulnerable to a Chinese slowdown, and that's why it's important to think about ways to diversify the economy. I have to say, one policy proposal, I'm not sure how far along it is, but the natural resource processing laws, I think, are very problematic for Indonesia. So the processing laws around nickel have worked okay for Indonesia, but Indonesia is a major global supplier of nickel. So you might assume from that putting processing laws on other resource exports is a good idea, but it's not. Indonesia is not in the same competitive position in bauxite, for example, as it is with nickel. So for nickel, Indonesia is such a major and important global producer that whatever Indonesia does, to some extent, the market will accept. But it's the only natural resource where that's the case. If you think of coal, Australia is a big producer of coal. There are other globally, even in India and in China, there's a lot of coal production. There are other producers of thermal and metallurgical coal, and so there are opportunities just to drop Indonesia as a trade partner. So my guess and other economists' guess is the natural processing laws, which require greater processing of ores and so on in Indonesia, are likely to be counterproductive, are likely to be a bad thing in terms of the economy and economic growth. So that's, I think, a challenge. I think the policy environment needs to, if you had the infrastructure, the people resources and so on to support greater processing, then it wouldn't be a problem. But that's where you should be investing, not having a law that requires processing. I think that's likely to be counterproductive. And I've mentioned this a number of times, but I keep banging on about it when I go to speak in Indonesia and other parts of Asia. It's an issue as well, especially South Asia. The ease of doing business as a policy for the new president is a major issue and needs to continue to be addressed. In terms of other challenges and opportunities, I think the interesting things I see in Indonesia are some of the advanced technologies in fintech and so on, in high tech around the ride sharing and things like that. So I think Indonesia is really interesting in the sense that it's kind of jumping technologies, as many emerging economies do. And so the opportunity for some of these startups to grow quickly and grow outside Indonesia is, I think, something that shouldn't be underestimated. And I guess I would like to see the government give more support to startups, both in terms of funding, but also the physical environment, the learning environment for startups and so on. So I think that's a big opportunity for Indonesia. And I do know that I've got a WhatsApp group that I'm part of that is very much about startups, but in Indonesia. But I think that's something that the government can support and should be supporting more. I'd say the same thing about Australia, to be honest. In terms of cooperation between Australia and Indonesia, it's interesting. Our economies are quite similar in a funny way, that our resources are a major part of our exports. So what that means is there's not really the need for us to trade as would be the case if Australia was not resource rich and wanting resources. So China is a much more natural trade partner for Australia and Indonesia than we are for one another. But there are major opportunities, I think, in services trade. So obviously education is a part of that, and I certainly would like to see more Australians travelling to Indonesia for short study visits and so on. I've encouraged that in some of my programs. So that's an opportunity, but of course also the tertiary education services that Australia offers to Indonesians are very much a part of this day. But more generally, again, I think Indonesia's some of the advances in services, technology and finance and so on that Indonesia has to offer great things for Australia. And of course, the other thing that Indonesia offers to Australia and could still be made a little bit easier in terms of visa access and so on is tourism, where, of course, Bali has long been a major destination for Australian tourists. But to me, when I talk to Australians, it's sort of disappointing, and I'm guilty of this myself, having only travelled to Java and Bali, but how few Australians have been to Java, how few Australians have been to other islands in Indonesia. So I think there's a major travel opportunity. So getting airline access and so on, and deregulating flight access for Garuda into Australia and potentially Australian airlines to other parts of Indonesia as well, I think is a major opportunity. And the good thing I think that we're seeing is a lot more high-level talks and cooperation between Australia and Indonesia, and again, I very much hope that continues to blossom in the coming years. So I wouldn't say Australia and Indonesia are at in the perfect place, but we're getting better and we're getting to understand one another better. And these visits are the best way to do that, whether they're tourism visits or trade delegations or the like, or any other kind of interaction. I again apologise for not being able to be with you in person today, but I do promise that I haven't been to Indonesia now for 4 years, and if you'd like to see me back next year, I'd really be trying to make sure that I can actually get physically to Jakarta and to Indonesia next year, because it's been too long since I've been back. I would welcome questions, and you can email me questions to my email address. I'm presuming that there won't be thousands of questions, but certainly if you have a question or two that you'd like to ask me, try to keep it sort of precise. I think some questions that people ask can tend to be a little bit unclear to interpret, but feel free to send me questions. Feel free, if you're in Melbourne, to reach out, and very happy to have a chat with you in Melbourne. I hope you enjoy the rest of this afternoon, or this afternoon's activities, and I look forward to meeting you again. Thank you very much for your time and your patience with me today. Thank you.